You tell the ebb and flowing of my stuff is not really flowing. All right, let's get started. Traditionally, perceptions of Comanche captivity have been shaped by a handful of sensational accounts given by Americans who fell into their hands, as Riviera Martinez has noted. The treatment of Madeleine Lockhart, for example, a 13-year-old girl abducted from her family's homestead of Guadalupe of the Guadalupe River in Texas, became well known through the writings of Mary A. Maverick. When Matilda returned to civilization, quote unquote, she had bruises and sores all over her body. Her nose had been cut off, her nostrils, quote, wide open and denuded of flesh. Mavericks recount how Matilda's captor would wake her, quote, by sticking a chunk of fire to her flesh, especially to her nose, and how they would shout and laugh like friends when she cried. Similarly, American readers learn of the ordeal of Rachel Plummer, who wrote narrative to 21 months servitude as a prisoner among the Comanche indigenous people, and became acquainted with the misfortunes of the Horn family after the publication of a narrative of captivity of Miss Horn and her two children, with that of Miss Harris by the Comanche indigenous peoples. Undoubtedly, such experience did occur among the Comanche captives, but proportionally, the Comanches took a few Anglo-American captives, and the ones they did take were often ransomed and released as soon as practicable. Far more abundant typically were the experience of humble Mexicans who lived where change in an instance when they were captured, and who frequently remained with the natives for several years, if not forever. Lacking the necessary means of connection, the families of these captives were unable to ransom their children, and wives were otherwise powerless to demand their return. Rash action by aggrieved parents wished to pursue indigenous abductors could easily result in further injury. The fate of these captives varied accordingly to ethnicity, social standings, and the vagaries of the slave traffic. Young Mexican captives from poor families who were unlikely to be ransomed were frequently traded back and forth among different clans and different bands. 12-year-old Jose Marie Guzman, for example, was abducted in May 1848 from a hacienda near Sambanas Hidalgo in Nueve Leon. The Comanche abductors crossed the Rio Grande near Laredo and traveled through western Texas for a month before reaching their rancheria. They spent a few days at the encampment of Lampan Apaches, who attempted to buy Jose Maria. On that occasion, the Comanche warriors who had captured the boy refused to sell him at a price that was offered. However, the Lampan Apaches remained interested. 8 days later, they paid a visit to the Comanche rancheria, offering a high price, where they were able to complete the transaction. There are numerous instances of captives exchanges among the Comanche and the Apache. At this time, in the late 1840s, the Comanches and the Lampan Apaches were allied, visiting each other regularly and trading captives as a matter of course. Jose Maria actually met most of the captives living in both rancherias, and, quote, during the 3 years that he lived with indigenous peoples, he noticed how the Lampians and Comanches campaigned together, and how Comanches often came to invite his indigenous people to go raiding together. Anglo-Americans and well-off Mexicans stood a better chance of being ransomed. Their families often hired agents or worked with government officials to locate their abducted relatives and negotiate their release. Naturally, the indigenous people themselves must have been aware that some of their captives were imminently ransomable, quote unquote, and were thus inclined to negotiate with intermediaries in a matter that could not have been too different from modern-day negotiations regardless of abduction. Such negotiations were sometimes conducted by agents who remained in regular contact with indigenous bands, knew about the captives held by each crew, and either acted on behalf of the relatives of the abductees or participated in this human traffic or on their own account and for their own benefit. Hispanic merchants who made a living by trading with the Plains indigenous people were the principal intermediaries. Given the strong ties like New Mexico with these indigenous people, it is no wonder that most of these merchants, known as Comancheros, were based in that territory. Celebrated American merchants, Jose Greg describes them as a class of indignant and rude individuals from the frontier villages, quote, who collected together several times a year and launched upon the plains with new trinkets and trophies of all cuts, and perhaps a bag of bread or pine oil. The Comancheros made the purchases of indigenous people, Mexican people, and Anglo-American captives a regular part of their overall commercial activities. Sometimes they acted on behalf of the victim's family. In the late 1849, for example, a part of Apaches ambushed a wagon train of Americans in the Santa Fe Trail, taking a white woman, Miss White, and her small daughters with them. After news of this fatal event reached Santa Fe, James S. Calhoun, the indigenous agent of New Mexico, tried to find a resolution. He quickly concluded that a military effort would not succeed. Instead, Calhoun hired the services of a Comanchero. Quote, this man is well known to respectable people here as a daring, fearless, and withdrawn, and withal a discreet man. A report to Washington. And he reported to Washington, quote, I promise to pay him $1,000 and other gratuities if he succeeds in bringing in to me Miss White and her daughter. The Mexican merchant departed within an hour, quote, manifesting the greatest confidence in his ability to command success. In spite of his speedy dispatch and confidence, the Comanchero returned empty-handed. By the time he reached the Apaches, they had killed the woman and absolutely refused to sell the daughter. More commonly, Comancheros ransom captives to resell them at a higher price. Additionally, traditionally, they had required captives held by Comanches, Apaches, and other indigenous peoples and resold them as chattel in New Mexico. With the rise in the number of Mexicans taking in the 19th century, Comancheros folded with this new stream of captives into their business. Americans on the frontier marveled at how these merchants treated their own kith and kin as chattel. I don't know. This dude, I don't know about this fucking writer. I'm sorry, everybody. Comancheros sometimes justified their acquisition of these captives by citing their compassion for fellow Christian strands among heathens. In spite of this pious posturing, in reality, such ransomed individuals had now become the property of their redeemers, and were certainly not free to return home. Instead, the Comanchero was now in the possession to negotiate another ransom with the captive's family, or attempt to resell him or her at a higher price. Remarkably, some Comancheros may actually have specialized in the traffic of Mexican captives, as the Mexican government discovered while investigating the case of the Fracassa family. Juan Jose Fracas and his 9-year-old son, Conspition had been out cutting wood near Chihuahua City when the party of indigenous attackers attacked them in the summer of 1845, unaliving the father and taking the boy. He was, quote, a blonde, long-faced, chubby boy with a big nose, easy to recognize. For 3 months, the mother made inquiries until she learned that her son was being held by a man named Juan Gutierrez, who lived in a small town in Padelas near Socorro in southern New Mexico. Further investigations revealed that Gutierrez held not only conviction, but also many others because he takes part in that type of traffic. Gutierrez ransomed most of his Mexican captives from the Apaches. Other merchants, the governor of New Mexico, ruefully conducted a similar traffic with Comanches and Dene. These cases emphasize the complexity of all ethnicities in the captive exchange that flourished along the border. The line separating captors from captives was blurred. We tend to think of indigenous Mexicans and Anglo-Americans as self-contained billiard balls colliding with one another on the frontier. In reality, however, 1/4 of all Kiowa indigenous people and nearly half of all Comanches were of Mexican descent, and many of them surely participated in raids against fellow Mexicans. Conversely, some Mexican communities, such as San Carlos and Chihuahua, were notorious for acquiring the spoils offered by indigenous peoples, including captives taken elsewhere in Mexico. I don't like this. This is bullshit. In much of the same way that Bent Fort in Arkansas, on the Arkansas River, ransomed captives to work there, and New Mexico absorbed goods and individuals stolen in Chihuahua. It is clear that the harsh frontier environment, ethnic and national loyalties frequently mattered less than the glint of profit and the imperative of survival. A family story. The Apaches were transformed by the general breakout of Mexico control of the border, although their experience resembles that of the Comanches. It also differed in some crucial respects. In colonial times, the Apaches had been among the worst victims of enslavement. In the 17th century, they had been forcibly transported to the silver mines of northern Mexico. In the 18th century, they had suffered a quarrelus, a bound for Mexico City and the Caribbean. But at the end of the silver boom, their ordeal came to a halt. The coloradas increased after 1860 as a presidio declined or were abandoned altogether. The celebrated Chiricahua Apaches, Chief Geronimo and his family lived through these searing transitions in western New Mexico and eastern Arizona. Geronimo's grandfather, Macho, had been chief of the Begdocohu band at the height of Spanish militarization of the frontier. The presidios in Chihuahua and Sonora had exerted so much pressure in the Chiricahua Apaches that many of them sued for peace in the 1780s, threatened by the horrors of enslavement and deportation. They agreed to settle in fixed communities under the watchful eye of the Spanish officials. Thus began the 30-year social engineering experiment. The Spaniards gave seeds, animals, farm tools, and even firearms to the Apaches, and in return, they were expected to become sedentary agriculturalists. The transition was never complete. The settled Apaches continued to move around hunting, gathering, and raiding on occasions, doing their best to maintain their traditional way of life. But they did become more reliant on crops and more dependent on Spanish clothes, weapons, and ammunition. Macho was remembered as quote, a man of peace, successful rancher, end quote, who enjoyed, quote, good repute among the Mexicans, end quote. Much of his life coincided with this extraordinary period of relative calm. Yet these indigenous settlements depended on the continued flow of money and the presence of the military. Mexico's struggles for independence eroded both off these pillars. The annual expenditures of the presidios in Llanos, the closest to the Begdocohi band, plummeted by more than 90%. The number of soldiers and the overall civilian population residing in the garrison was also declined significantly in the 1820s and had in the 1820s, as had happened elsewhere along the frontier. Mexico prolonged wars and economic ruin fanned the fires of change. Geronimo was born around 1823, barely 2 years old, after Mexico's independence. As the country's defenses crumbled, the Begdocohi people abandoned their settlements and retreated into New Mexico. Mogollon Mountains, an impact extremely rugged, range 30 miles in length, peaks soaring above 10,000 feet, deep canyons and gorges, and mesa buffeted by strong winds and violent storms offered these Apaches a near impregnable refuge, as well as an immediate access to various Mexican communities and ranches. During Geronimo's youth, no single individual led the Chiricahua Apaches or even the Begdocohi band, which was further subdivided into local groups and extended families which with its own chief. But there was one warrior who captured the imagination of many young Apaches. The Mexicans knew him as Fuerte, strong, or Mangas, Coloradas, red sleeves. The 6 feet 5 inches tall, he towered over other Apaches and Mexicans alike. He was, quote, clothed with muscles, end quote, according to the enthusiastic description of an American physician, and had deep set dark eyes and a posture as, quote, straight as a reed from which his arrows were made, end quote. This formidable man helped pioneer new relationships between the Chiricahuas and Mexico. In one of his earliest raids, probably between 1812 and 1815, Mangas Coloradas took a Mexican captive named Carmen and made her one of his wives. This young man turned to be so willful that some Apaches complained she, quote, didn't know her place. A reminder that even captives could improve their situation and assert power. During the 1820s and 1830s, as Mexico pared down its rationing system and reduced the numbers of soldiers posted in Sonora and Chihuahua, many Apaches left their communities around the Mexican presidios. After more than a generation of relative peace, many Chiricahuans were still eager to reach an accommodation with the Mexican government, but many others became ruthless and quite receptive to war leaders such as Mangas Coloradas. By the 1840s, this impressive individual had emerged as a prominent leader of the war faction among all of the Chiricahu bands. Geronimo came of age hearing stories of Mangas Coloradas, quite possibly trained under his supervision. The adolescents sometimes accompanied raiding parties, but were limited to observing the campaign from a distance. His apprenticeship finally ended in 1846 as Mexico and the United States teetered on the brink of war. As Geronimo later recalled, quote, when I was very happy, for I could go wherever I wanted and do whatever I liked. I had not been under the control of any individuals, but the customs of our tribe prohibited me from sharing the glories of the warpath until the council admitted me. Geronimo also had other incentives. For some time, he had wished to be married, to marry Alope, the daughter of a Bedokahome man named No Po So, but No Po So was not favorable, disposed towards him. When the young man asked for Alopo's hand, No Po So demanded many ponies. Quote, I made no reply, Geronimo recalled. Quote, but in a few days appeared before his wigwam with the herd of ponies and took with me Alope. The days must have been weeks during which Geronimo gathered the required animals for the Mexican ranches and towns. The couple's early life coincided with the great increase in the number of Chiricahuan raids into Mexico. At the conclusion of the United States War with Mexico in 1848, the international border was redrawn, and the Chiricahuas ended up on the American side. They could now raid Mexico, then retreat across the border, where the Mexican troops could not follow. Officials in both countries recognized the seriousness of this problem. According to Article 11 of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which officially ended the war, quote, considering that a great part in the extreme, it is solemnly agreed that all such incursions shall be forcibly restrained by the government of the United States, whensoever this may be necessary. If policing the If policing a 2,000-mile border today is difficult, it is utterly impossible at the time when there were no fences, passports, or other impediments to the people's movement. The Chiraracajos, headed by the extraordinary cadre of leaders, continued to launch raids after raid into Mexico. Among their leaders were Mangas Coloradas, who even at 60 years of age remained a formidable presence on the battlefield. Cochais, whose reputation for courage was unsurpassed among the Apaches, Miguel Noravana, who was a boy, had been kept for a decade in Mexico, was a servant, and was Mexico as a servant, and whose seething resentment towards his former captors made him a formidable foe. Joe, a cousin of Geronimo's, who had a speech impediment, but was able to lead his warriors by using hand signals, and Geronimo himself, who showed great promise from an early age. During this period of active raiding, both Apaches and Mexicans took captives frequently, using them as chips to bring the other side to the bargain table or to retrieve prisoners. One of the Chiracajos raids changed Geronimo's life forever. At the start of 1851, the Chiracajos launched two simultaneous campaigns into the Mexican state of Sonora. One was held by Mangas Coloradas and included Cochais, Miguel Noravana, Joe Geronimo, and about 150 battle-tested men. This formidable party made its way almost to the outskirts of the capital city of Hermosillo, and another Apache force was similar in size and kept to the west of the first, retargeting the mountains, communities, and ranches of the Chahurarapa district in Sierra Madre and incidental. The two parties met less resistance than anticipated. The people of Sonora seemed overwhelmed and even paralyzed by the simultaneous raid. The group of Mangas, Coloradas, and Geronimo succeeded in rounding up around 300 head of stock and no less than 1,000 horses. But on January 20th, the Mexican patrol spotted a large cloud of dust produced by the returning indigenous people just to the south of the place called Paso Hendiando, Stinky Well. The soldiers dutifully moved into position and set up an ambush. The battle that ensued started with bullets and arrows, but soon developed into hand-to-hand combat. Mangas Coloradas, never given to exaggeration, called it, quote, a war of the knife, end quote. In the part of the field where Geronimo fought, he was the only man left alive. The Mexican losses were unprecedented. Out of 100 men, 26 were killed, including most of the officers, and 46 sustained serious wounds. A mere 15 were left unscathed. It was the most crushing Apache victory over Mexican troops in history. For Geronimo, however, this great victory was a prelude to tragedy. 1 month after the showdown, Mangas, Coloradas, Geronimo, and other leaders caught everyone by surprise by riding into Presidio Llanos in the neighboring state of Chihuahua. The Apaches were there to sound out the local authorities before opening peace negotiations in Sonora. but their visit also had a commercial purpose. The victorious Apache needed to dispossess of their plunders, and the merchants of Llanos had long made their living by acquiring and reselling indigenous loot. One of the Apaches, named Tapila, began shopping around a saddle that had belonged to the Sonoran captain killed by Pozo Hendandio. His successor was military commander of Sonaro, Colonel Jose Marie Corcaso, exploded with rage on hearing that these Apaches, who had killed so many Mexicans, had been warmly received by the Presidio. On impulse, Colonel Carrasco gathered his men and crossed into Chihuahua. Without informing anyone, his forces descended on Llanos and encircled the nearby Apache encampment, where Geronimo's family was being bartered, was still bartering. The Apache men were absent from the camp at the time of the attack. Only when they began to gather at nightfall in the thicket of a nearby river did they realize that the full extent of their losses. As Geronimo put it, quote, I found that my aged mother, my young wife, and my 3 small children were among the slain. He had lost everything that day. I silently turned away and stood by the river. Geronimo went on. How long I stood there, I don't know, but when I saw the warriors arranging for a council, I took my place. For the rest of his life, Geronimo harbored a great hatred for Mexicans. As he said, quote, my feelings towards the Mexicans did not change. I never ceased to plan for their punishment. And to the remarkable extent, he was able to exact his revenge. His raids are the stuff of legends. We never chained prisoners or kept them in confinement, but they seldom got away. He remembered, quote, Mexican men, when captured, were compelled to cut wood and herd horses. Mexican women and children were treated as our own people, end quote. Reflecting on the arc of his life in 1905 to 1906, when he was over 80 years of age, he said, quote, I am old now, and I shall never go on the warpath again. But if I were young and followed the warpath, I would lead into old Mexico. The rising tide of servitude. Comanche and Apache raids ravaged northern Mexico in the middle decades of the 19th century, resulting in hundreds of captives being taken, but the expansion of other slavery went far deeper than that. After independence, Mexico extended their citizenship rights to all indigenous residing there and abolished slavery. In the absence of slavery, the only way for Mexicans to bid workers to their properties and businesses was by extending credit to them. As a result, debt, coinage proliferated throughout Mexico and in the American Southwest after coinage proliferated. In the American Southwest after slavery was abolished there in the 1860s and emerged as a principal mechanism of the other slavery. The trappings of deep coinage there in place in Mexico as early as 1587, when an indigenous from Manchocan recounted how some Spaniards had advanced him money, quote, at a far high price than it was worth, and then seized my possessions and took me and my wife and children, and they have kept us locked up for 20 years, moving us from textile factories to another. The indigenous people did not know the amount he still owed. or how much money he and his family had earned during their 12 years of forcible servitude. But he was certain that peonage was worse than slavery because, unlike the Africans with whom he toiled, he was not allowed to wander the streets freely, even on Sundays. Over the centuries, debt peonage spread it. It's Peonage. As the Spanish crown abolished indigenous slavery in 1542, prohibiting the granting of new encomendations in 1673, and phased out repartimentos after 1777, debt peonage gained ground. After Mexico declared its independence from Spain, the process gained momentum. States throughout the country enacted servitude and vagrancy laws. The state of Yucatan, for example, regulated the movement of servants through a certificate system. No servants could abandon his master without having fulfilled the terms of his contract, and could not be hired by any other employer without first presenting a certificate showing that he owed, quote, absolute nothing to his previous employers. In Chiapas, the state legislature introduced a servitude code in 1827, allowing owners to retain their workers by force if necessary until they had fulfilled the terms of their contracts. Lashes, lockdowns, and shackles were fulfilled. The terms of these were commonly used. The same was true in Coahuila. I don't know how to say it. Coahuila. In 1851, the state legislature there allowed owners to flog their peons. Increasingly, the governor opposed the measures because it would affect more than 1/3 of all the people of Coahuila. According to his calculations, peonage in neighboring Nuevo Leon may have been just as common as was especially galing, because it was customary to transfer debts from father to son, thus perpetuating a system of inherited bondage. In these ways, servitude for the liquidation of debts spread all over Mexico. Although Mexico's faltering economy kept the demand for workers in check in the early decades after independence, once economic growth resumed later in the centuries, employers went to great lengths to procure and retain coerced laborers. The muckraking American journalist named John Kenneth Turner had unique access to this expanding world of servitude and provided the most details portrayed of its workings. Posing as a millionaire investor, Turner traveled to Yucatan in 1908. He made his way to Merida, a town that boasted extravagant masons and was surrounded by about 150 Jacquin haciendas. I don't know how to say it. Sorry, buddy. The planters there received the American warmly. These, quote, little Rockefellers, as Turner called them, had grown rich by selling rope and twine made from Hayenquin plant. In the earlier years of the century, Yucatan's total exports in Harlequin had reached nearly 250 million pounds a year. But a panic in 1907 had cut severely into their profits. Quote, so they needed ready cash, and they were willing to take it from anyone who came, end quote, Turner explained. And then, quote, hence my imaginary money was the open sesame of their club and to their farms. Turner's disguise as a prospect investor also allowed him to ask freely about how workers were hired. Slavery is against the law. We do not call it slavery, quote unquote. The planters told him again and again. They generally refer to the Mayans, the Yaquas, and even the Koreans working at their haciendas as people or laborers, never as slaves. The Haquan kings were quite forthcoming about how debt served as a tool of coercion. Quote, when we do not consider that we own our laborers, we consider that they are in debt to us. The president of the Agricultural Labor Chamber of Yucatan told Turner, quote, and we do not consider that we buy and sell them. We consider that they transfer their debt, and a man goes with the debt, end quote, in spite of the verbal obfuscation. The fact was that an indigenous worker would be acquired for 400 pesos in Yucatan. Quote, if you buy now, you buy at a very good time, end quote, Turner was told. Quote, the panic has put the price down. 1 year ago, the price of each man was $100,000. Obviously, the reason the going rate was uniform was not at all. Peons were equally in debt, but that there was a market for them, irrespective of their debt. Quote, we don't keep much account of the debt, clarified by one planter. Quote, because it doesn't matter after you've got possession of the man. After paying the price, Turner was told he would get the worker along with a photograph of an identification papers. Quote, and if your man runs away, another planter added assuredly, quote, the papers are all the authorities required for you to get him back again. Turner asked candidly about how to treat his worker. Quote, it is necessary to whip them. Oh yes, very necessary. Open Philippe G. Canton, Secretary of the Agricultural Chamber. Quote, for there is no way to make them do what you wish. What other means is there of enforcing the discipline of the farm? If we do not whip them, they would do nothing, end quote. The American journalist witnessed a formal beating with all the workers assembled during one of the hacienda visits. The young man received 15 lashing across the back with a heavy, wet rope. All Haquan plantations had compates. I can't say it. Capataces, or foremen, who carried canes to prod and whack the indigenous people. Turner wrote, quote, I do not remember visiting a single field in which I did not see some of this punching and prodding and whacking going on. Slavery in Mexico in the 20th century. Yes, quote, quote, yes, I found it, quote, end quote, wrote Turner in his extraordinary episode published on the eve of the Mexican Revolution. Quote, I found it first in Yucatan. According to him, the slave population in Yucatan consisted of 8,000 Yaquan indigenous people forcibly transported from Sonora, 3,000 Koreans who had departed from port of Akon and were on 4 or 5 year labor contracts, and between 5,000 Mayans who formerly owned the lands of the Haquan kings now own. Turner estimated that in all of Mexico there may have been 750,000 slaves, a figure that is almost certainly exaggerated, but that underscores the expansion of other slavery during the last few decades of the 19th century. Chapter 10. 2 more chapters to go, everybody. Americans and the other slavery. Americans poured into the West during the first half of the 19th century. In 1800s, they occupied a band of settlers along the Atlantic coast that reached from western New York to upper Ohio, south along the Ohio River, then through the central Tennessee and the Cherokee lands into the southern and coastal Georgia. 50 years later, they were spilling across the plains of Michigan, the hills of Wisconsin, and into eastern Iowa, Missouri, and Arkansas. They were also washing over the Gulf Coast from Florida west of Texas, and after the discovery of gold in the late 1840s, all the way to California and Oregon, larger than any country in Western Europe. This area recently opened to settlement became home to about 10 million Americans, who represented an astounding 44% of the total U.S. population in 1850. Not only were these pioneers we'll call them settlers, experiencing the novelty of a region, but they were also embarking on their journey of self-discovery and re-examination of their benefits about human relations. Accustomed to African slavery, they were now confronted by the existence of indigenous slavery. Variations of the same story unfolded in many quarters of the West. Easterners went from surprise to curiosity, and depending on their temperament, the persuasion either acceptance or outrage into New Mexico. The best evidence of these reactions comes from letters and diaries of westbound settlers. James C. Calhoun, who had never stepped foot in New Mexico when he was appointed indigenous agent for the territory in April 1849. He had grown up in the South, where he had divided his time between managing a shipping firm based in Columbus, Georgia, and pursuing the successful career of state politics. Of course, he's a fucking settler. Sensibly, before taking his post, he traveled to Washington, D.C. to gather information. But as the Commissioner of Indigenous Affairs warned him, quote, "So little is known here of the conditions and situations of the indigenous peoples in that region that the department relies on you to furnish it with such statistical and other information." All the agent could find was a memorandum listing New Mexico's principal indigenous nations, Apaches, quote, an indolent and cowardly people, end quote, Utes, a hardly warlike people, subsisting by the chase, Dene, an industrious, intelligent, warlike tribe, Comanches, a numerous and warlike people, and so on. The document estimated that there were 37,000 indigenous, including Pueblos, in New Mexico, and a figure that already gave Calhoun a sense of enormity of the task at hand. Yet nothing could have prepared this Georgian for what he found on the ground. Along the way to Santa Fe, Calhoun heard rumors about native hostilities against Americans that made him apprehensive. He even offered to raise a regiment of volunteers on behalf of the federal government to provide protection. Once he was in Santa Fe, his concern was increased. He reported that indigenous relations in New Mexico were, quote, of a much more formidable character than had been anticipated, end quote. A feared and feared that the number of U.S. troops, 600 infantrymen in total, was utterly insufficient to control the indigenous peoples. This was still speculation. Calhoun's first tangible experience occurred 1 month after his arrival, when he joined an expedition to, quote, the seat of the supreme power of the Navajo, of the Dene tribe of indigenous peoples, the famous Canyon de Chelly of Arizona. It was a daring undertaking. For 3 years, the Navajo people had been stepping up their raids in New Mexico's settlements to put in. See, they're stepping up their raids in settlement because people are taking their goddamn land. To put an end to these attacks and force the Dene people into signing a peace treaty. The territorial governor decided to visit the Dene stronghold, accompanied by a detachment of soldiers and the recently arrived Calhoun. From Santa Fe, the party traveled due west through the wide open party-colored plains. After a week of slow progress and difficult conditions, which included camping in places with no water, wood, or grass, they finally reached the gigantic fan-shaped gash in the earth. That is the Canyon del Chelly. The travelers entered the canyon in silence. Streams of water laced the sides and bottom of this enormous oasis that supported extensive fields of corn, wheat, melons, squash, and beans, as well as peach orchards, which would have been especially green and luscious in early September. Groves of pine, juniper, and cedar were available all around, and water, in any desirable quantity, could be procured simply by digging a few feet into the stark reddish soil. Hundreds of indigenous warriors taking up position on the surrounding heights and, quote, dashing with great speed from point to point, evidently in great perturbation. Closely monitored the progress of the American delegation. Early the next morning, the head chief of the Dene Nation, Marendio Martinez, presented himself with some warriors and requested to see the new Mexican government. The two leaders had a long conversation and agreed to sign a treaty the very next day. In the past, whenever the Dene people had faced punitive expeditions sent out by the Spaniards, Mexicans, or Americans, they had been quick to negotiate. And in every case, the treaty making ritual had involved giving some captives. Chief Martinez returned the day after the initial conversation, accompanied by 4 captives: Antonio Jose, a 10-year-old from Jimenez Tosidio, another boy taken from a corral near Rio Grande, Marcitio, a young man from Sakura, who had been held in captive for years and had no longer been able to speak Spanish. Jose Ngacho, an adult originally from Santa Fe who had refashioned himself as a Dene and had 2 wives and 3 children, even though he still belonged to an indigenous name, Wato. Exactly how Chief Martinez persuaded the owners to part with these 4 individuals is unknown. At that time, the Dene people held hundreds of slaves seized in raids on the Pueblos, Utes, Comanches, Hispanics, and Americans. These multi-ethnic captives rendered valuable services, tended orchards and cornfields, and looking after large flocks of sheep accumulated by the people of the canyon. Indeed, a slave-holding class seems to have emerged among the Nene, which I disagree with. A dozen or so rich headmen, each held up to 40 or 50 slaves in pinions, along with many other Dene independents. A key provision of the treaty between Martinez and the New Mexican government acquired that Dene nations to surrender, quote, all American and Mexican captives on or before the 9th day of October next, exactly 1 month after the day of the signing. As for the 4 captives about to be released, although the 2 boys were excited to return to their families, the adults were not as enthusiastic. The novelty of the home in the New Mexican town seemed to excite Marcitio somewhat, while Jose Ignacio much preferred to remain with his Dene family. Quote, notwithstanding his peonage, Agent Calhoun met these captives and followed their fates until they were returned, except for the one so unfortunately married, who was allowed to stay with the Dene. This was his first recorded experience with the other slavery. The Georgian had lived all of his life surrounded by black people that were slaves and was not particularly interested in indigenous people in general. His letters were entirely lacking in references to the ancient ruins or theories of past civilization that impressed so many other travelers, but his familiarity with chattel slavery in the South made him the ideal observer of indigenous bondage in the West, apt to elaborate on its detail and draw comparisons. By the time Calhoun had spent 6 months as an indigenous agent, he had formed a clear image of New Mexico as a land with a core population of Pueblo indigenous people, Mexican villagers, and Americans surrounded by what he called, quote, the 4 wild tribes, the Apaches, the Dene, Utes, and Comanches, quote, those within the circle of those who form a circle look upon each other as natural enemies, end quote. Calhoun explains to his superiors in Washington, quote, and they are essentially internally at war, robbing and enslaving each other. Oh my God, what an ass, end quote. Out of the four, quote, wild tribes, end quote, the Dene alone possessed all the necessities of life, according to Calhoun. They cultivate the soil very successfully, owned enormous herds of goats and sheep, and wove some of the finest blankets in the region. They could live on their own without preying on others. They don't do that. The agent was convinced, however, that the other 3 groups survived, chiefly by their depredation. Getting the Apaches, Utes, and Comanches to stop their raiding campaigns would require enormous outlays of money by the U.S. government and a strong military presence. Nothing less would accomplish the last piece. In the meantime, the market for captives thrived in New Mexico. Calhoun described this market in some detail. The first thing he observed was that indigenous captives in New Mexico were not referred to as, quote, slaves, but as peons. Clearly, the shift to the debt peonage was well underway there, and the system was highly coercive. According to Calhoun, peons could escape their servitude only by paying a certain amount to their owners. Indeed, the indigenous agents likened peons to chattel slavery. Peons were peons. You are aware is but another name for slaves, as that term is understood in our southern states. He explained in a letter to the commissioner to the Indigenous Affairs, adding that the main difference was that the peonage system was not confined to a particular, quote, race of the human family, end quote, but applied it to, quote, all colors and tongues, end quote. Indigenous purchased, and Mexicans bought other Mexicans, and yet no one seemed to have the slightest objection to being purchased of their own Keith and kin. Quite on the contrary, they believed that, quote, the right to buy and sell captives is perfect, and that no human power can disrupt that right, end quote. After broaching, end quote. After broaching, end quote. After broaching provided some details about the market for captives and relationships with peons. Unlike Georgia or Louisiana, their slave auctions were held in public in centralized places. In New Mexico, the traffic of humans was a great deal more fragmented, as owners brought captives from the Camacherios and acquired, quote, the labor of convicts at public auctions. They also haggled privately with their peons over debts and terms of service. Despite the nature of these scattered transactions, New Mexicans tactically agreed on proximate price ranges for different types of captives, criminals, and peons. Their value depended on, quote, age, sex, beauty, and usefulness, reported Calhoun. Quote, good-looking females, not having passed the, quote, sear of yellow leaf, end quote, are valued at $50 to $150 each. Males, as they may be useful, one half less, never more. This remarkable price premium for females harkened all the way back to the 16th century. Like any other Americans, Calhoun accepted the bondage system that existed in the West. He reported the practice to his superiors and learned many details about it, but he did nothing to prevent Hispanics and Anglo-Americans from holding men, women, and children in peonage. Only in cases covered by Article 11 of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which acquired the return of all Mexican captives, did the indigenous agents make efforts to secure and release of those bondage. Even in those cases, Calhoun purchased the captives from their owners, thus validating the system, even as he returned them to their families across the border. Interesting. I don't like Calhoun. Looking back a little bit, yeah. All right, American ranchers. Calhoun merely tolerated the other slavery of the West, but other Americans went several steps beyond that by actively participating in it and enshrining it in law. In the 1840s, colonialists were attracted to California because of its broad valleys and booming ranching economy. Where there they found a baronial society that impressed them deeply. About 100 Mexican families owned princely domains scattered from San Diego to San Francisco Bay. It is easy to imagine the rolling hills and the properties that in some cases extended all the way to spectacular California coastline, and the large houses made of thick adobe walls. These houses were a curious combination of grandeur and lack of material comforts. However, as there were few possessions inside, the enormous ranches had originated in a well-meaning but ultimately disastrous order from Mexico City. In 1833, the Mexican government had mandated the dismantling of the Spanish missions that had long served as California's social and economic backbone. Mission indigenous peoples were to receive plots of land, seeds, cattle, and tools. The predictable results, however, was a land grab, as wealthy and well-connected individuals took the lion's share of the land. In Northern California, the personification of the ranching barons was a rotund man with bushy sideburns named Marindio Guadalupe Vegeo, or Don Guadalupe for short. As military commanders, Don Guadalupe personally welcomed the foreigners. He spoke French well and English tolerably, according to one discerning witness, and was quite gregarious. Jesus. Indeed, Don Guadalupe invited recent arrivals into his home and displayed a hospitality that became legendary. The Vallejo's killed cows and turkeys to feed guests and offer tamales and enchiladas liberally. I don't know what that means. After these meals, guitars were tuned, and singing and dancing could be expected. Englishmen, Americans, Frenchmen, Swedes, Swiss, and Russians all passed through the Vallejo's Casa Grande in Sonoma. Yeah. One of the first things visitors noticed in the Vallejo's home was the ubiquitous crew of servants. In a custom reminiscent in antebellum South, each Don Guadalupe's children, boys and girls, had dedicated indigenous servants. Don Guadalupe's wife, Donna Francisca Benicia Corelio, had two servants cater to her personal needs. Besides these personal valets, the Vallejo's kept a sizable staff around the house. 5 to 6 women grinding corn and making tortillas. 6 or 7 laboring in the kitchen. And though not learned in the culinary arts, as taught by Italians in French books, they made very palatable and savory dishes, end quote. Recalling Don Guadalupe's younger brother, Salvador Vaggio, where there were 5 to 6 women washing clothes and up to a dozen sewing and spinning. According to the younger Vallejo, it was not uncommon for wealthy Californians to keep retinues of 20 to 60 indigenous people. Foreign visitors who ventured out in Don Guadalupe's home and into his near Rancho Petaluma were able to gain a great deal more insight. At its peak in the earlier 1840s, this 66,000-acre ranch was tended by 700 workers, an entire encampment of indigenous people, badly clothed and pretty nearly in the state of nature, living in and around the property, and did all the work. As Salvador Vaggio recalled, quote, They tilled our soil, pastures our cattle, shear our sheep, cut our lumber, built our houses, paddled our boats, made tiles for our houses, ground our grain, killed our cattle, dressed our hides for the market, and made our unburned bricks, while the women made excellent servants, took good care of our children, and made every one of our meals. End quote. The Vallejo's were quick to paint a picture of benevolent patriarchy. Quote, those people we considered as members of our families. End quote. Salvador remembered, quote, he loved them and they loved us. Our intercourse was always pleasant. The indigenous people knew that our superior education gave us the right to command and rule over them. Jesus Christ. But what seems pleasant and natural to the Vajos was decidedly less to the indigenous. Some workers of the Rancho Petaluma were formal mission indigenous people. As administrators of the mission of San Francisco de Solano, Don Guadalupe had ample opportunity not only to dispose of mission lands and resources. In fact, his Sonoma home, the military barracks, and the entire plaza laid a former mission lands, but also a bind ex nephotypes to his properties through undebtedness. Faced with dwindling resources and loss of land, former missions indigenous people had little choice but to put themselves under the protection of overlords like Vajos. Other indigenous laborers had been captured by military campaign north of Sonoma. As commander of the Northern California frontier, Don Guadalupe had a guard of about 50 men to keep order in the region and prevent indigenous people from stealing cattle. He also used his guardsmen to procure servants. He was not alone in doing so, especially after the secularization of the mission in 1833. Mexican ranchers sent out armed expeditions to seize indigenous peoples practically every year. Oh my god. I hate when my nose is fucking running. Alright, where was I? He was not alone. The mission of the ranchers seized the indigenous meat packed everywhere, and as many as six times in 1837, 4 in 1838, and 4 in 1839. Mexican ranchers pioneered the other slavery in California, but American colonialists readily adapted to it. They acquired properties of their own and faced the age-old problem of finding laborers. Their options were limited. No black slaves existed in California, at least not in the open. As Mexico's national government had abolished African slavery in 1829, Asian workers were still rare. In the early 1840s, Don Guadalupe kept 4 native Hawaiians at Rancho Petaluma, as did the neighboring American ranchers named John Sinclair and some others. The Asian trade began after the gold discovery of 1848 and would reach significant numbers only years later. Indigenous labor was the only viable option. Although the indigenous population of Alta California had been cut by half during the Spanish and Mexican period, roughly from 300,000 to 150,000 indigenous peoples still comprised of more abundant pool of laborers, short of worker and land themselves. White owners had to rely on them. Tracing of the earliest Euro-American settlers were still visible in Northern California. John Sutter was a proprietor of the large fort by the junction of the Sacramento and American rivers that is now the major tourist attraction in Midtown Sacramento. George C. Yungt was the first Euro-American to settle permanently in the Napa Valley, the wine-sipping town. The Youngtonville is named after him. Pearson B. Reading was the recipient of a huge land grant that would give rise to the city of Redding. The Andrew Cassell, a ruthless entrepreneur, built a ranching operation just south of Clear Lake that is now the town of Kensleydale. These foreigners were acquisitive possessed good business sense and were quick to appreciate the advantages of cohortions of indigenous labor. Josa Bedlin, a member of the first wagon trail of Americans traveling from Missouri to California, characterized the local indigenous people as, quote, the P word and inoffensive. Observed that their apprenticeship in the Spanish mission had made them, quote, very useful servants and laboring men of the rancheros and citizens. John Bedwell of the same group pointed out that it was possible to employ, quote, any number of indigenous people by giving them a lump of beef every week and paying them about $1 for the same time, end quote. A Massachusetts doctor named John Marsh offered clear guidance on how to treat indigenous workers. Quote, nothing more is necessary for their complete subjugation by kindness in the beginning and a little well-timed severity when manifestly deserved. And even when the letter method became a necessity, Dr. Marsh reassured his readers the California indigenous people, quote, submit to oh my gosh, I can't say this word. Let me see what this word means. Where's it at? I just lost it. Where did it go? Subjugation and kindness. Manifesting the necessity. Oh, there it is. Let me go look up this word, everybody, really quick. Come on. Let me go see what this word looks.